The day the letter arrived, the house was too quiet for a Tuesday. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the heavy silence that settles after the last visitor leaves, when grief finally notices you're alone and moves in. The funeral lilies had started to curl in their vases, the sympathy cards lined the mantel like tiny paper gravestones. I hadn't planned to open any more mail that week. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, cream-colored and thick, my name written in the deliberate loops of my mother's handwriting. My throat tightened. She'd been gone 3 weeks. Her will had already been read. There wasn't supposed to be anything left to say. For 10 full minutes I just stared at it. It was sealed with red wax, her favorite rose stamp pressed into the center, and a faint smell of lavender clung to it. My mother never did anything halfway, even from the grave apparently. When I finally slit the wax open, the paper inside crackled softly, like it resented being disturbed. 3 pages, written front and back in blue ink. At the top, in the neat block letters she used when she was afraid her emotions might show, were 5 words: "Do exactly as I say." I laughed, a quick, brittle sound that bounced off the tile floor. Of course she'd start that way. Even dead, she was giving orders. But as I read, the laughter drained out of me. "If you're holding this, Emma, it means I couldn't finish what I started. You'll be angry at me for keeping secrets, but please finish this for me. Go to the house on Hawthorne Street. The key is taped under the top drawer of my desk. Don't trust anyone who asks about it. And whatever you do, do not open the second box until you've done everything else." The handwriting wavered halfway down the page, as if she'd written through tears. My mother wasn't dramatic. She was the type who color-coded grocery lists. So for her to write something like this, something that sounded almost like a warning, made my skin prickle. I read the rest twice before I realized my hands were shaking. She'd included a list of names. Some I recognized: my Uncle David, her old business partner, a neighbor we hadn't seen since I was 10. Others meant nothing to me. At the bottom, she'd drawn a small arrow pointing to a final line: "If you ever loved me, do not tell your father." My father. The man who'd spent the entire funeral sitting in the front pew like a statue, offering condolences to guests with a smile that never touched his eyes. I folded the pages and set them down, but I couldn't look away from them. The afternoon light had shifted, turning everything gold and sickly. The refrigerator hummed in the background, steady and oblivious. I kept thinking about Hawthorne Street. When I was little, that address meant nothing to me, but I'd heard it whispered once, late at night during one of my parents' fights. My mother had cried, and my father had said something like, "That place should have stayed buried." I'd forgotten it until now. The logical part of me said it was nonsense. Maybe she'd hidden old photo albums or some piece of property paperwork. But another part, the part that knew the tone of my mother's voice when she was terrified, knew this wasn't about keepsakes. That night I couldn't sleep. The letter sat on my nightstand under the lamp, edges curling slightly from where my fingers had held it too long. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the line again: "Don't trust anyone who asks about it." By 2 a.m. I was in her old study, flashlight in hand, rummaging through drawers. The key was exactly where she'd said: small, brass, cold. For a moment I just held it in my palm, feeling the weight of it, of everything she hadn't told me. The study smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. Her framed certificate still hung on the wall, all that proof of the life she'd lived so neatly. How could there be anything left to hide? Still, I slid the key into my pocket. Outside, rain had started tapping against the windows. The house seemed to breathe around me, settling into its foundations. I thought about calling someone, my brother maybe, but the idea of explaining the letter felt impossible. What if it was nothing? What if it was something? In the end, curiosity won. It always did with me, and my mother knew it. When dawn crept in, pale and uncertain, I packed a bag, flashlight, phone charger, bottled water, and the letter. I left a note on the counter for my father. Just one line: "Running errands, back tonight," and locked the door behind me. The air outside smelled of wet asphalt, and the promise of something I couldn't name. Hawthorne Street was 30 minutes away. By the time I pulled onto the cracked driveway of a small ivy-covered house that shouldn't have felt familiar but did, the sun had burned through the last of the morning mist. And when I stepped out of the car, key in hand, I realized my mother hadn't been warning me away. She'd been leading me somewhere she couldn't go herself. The house on Hawthorne Street looked like it had been forgotten by the world. Its paint had peeled into pale ribbons. Ivy crept up the walls like green veins, and a rusted mailbox leaned forward as if tired of waiting for news. The windows were dark, not shattered, not boarded up, just waiting. I parked on the curb, left the engine idling, and stared for what must have been 5 full minutes. I didn't even know how long the place had been empty. The first thing that struck me when I stepped out was the smell. Not rot exactly, but something old: damp wood, wet earth. The air felt heavier, like it was carrying secrets that hadn't been aired out in decades. I slid the brass key from my pocket. It was smaller than I remembered, but solid, like something that had waited a lifetime for this moment. The lock protested, then turned with a low metallic sigh. The door creaked open. The first thing I noticed was the dust. It hung in the air like fog, catching streaks of sunlight that slanted through torn curtains. There was furniture, but it wasn't abandoned junk. It was arranged. A table with 2 cups sitting opposite each other, a coat still hanging on the rack. It looked like someone had just left, not fled, just stopped. I whispered to no one. "Mom, what the hell were you doing here?" The words sounded too loud in that empty house. There was a faint hum, maybe from the refrigerator, and then silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I took slow steps inside, my shoes crunching on grit. The smell was stronger here. Old perfume, paper, something faintly metallic. On the wall near the stairs hung a framed photograph. It was yellowed, edges curled. My mother stood next to a man I didn't recognize, not my father. She was younger, her hair shorter, her smile softer. There was something intimate about the way they stood, shoulders nearly touching, a private world between them. I reached out, fingertips grazing the glass. Dust came away on my skin. That's when I saw it, an envelope tucked behind the frame. Same cream paper, same blue ink. My heart started hammering as I pulled it free. Inside, just one line. "You're not supposed to be here yet." I froze. The words blurred in my vision as my pulse climbed into my throat. The logical part of me tried to reason. Maybe she'd written this as part of some scavenger hunt-like task. But my mother had never been whimsical. She'd been deliberate, precise. And if she thought I wasn't supposed to be here yet, then when was I? I folded the note, shoved it in my pocket, and looked around again. There was a faint trail of footprints on the dusty floor. Fresh, not mine. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Maybe recently, maybe still here. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing, but the air shifted. A door somewhere upstairs clicked softly, and that was enough to send adrenaline flooding through me. I took a step back toward the front door, but then I saw something glinting on the table. Another key. Smaller, newer, and beneath it, another note in my mother's handwriting. "Good. You're braver than I thought. The truth is upstairs, but once you see it, you can't unsee it." For a moment, I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring up the staircase. It spiraled halfway before disappearing into shadow. My phone had 1 bar of service. I considered calling someone, my brother, my father, even the police, but every instinct screamed no. This wasn't something outsiders could explain away. This was between my mother and me. So I climbed. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the air growing colder as I ascended. Halfway up, I saw another photo on the wall, this time of a little girl. Dark hair, big brown eyes, standing between my mother and the same man from before. The man's hand rested gently on the girl's shoulder. But the girl wasn't me. I stopped breathing. My mother had never mentioned another child. Not once. I leaned closer. On the back of the frame, written in faded ink, was a name. Clara. At the top of the stairs was a narrow hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath my steps. The first door I opened revealed a bedroom, tidy but coated in dust. The second door stuck halfway before giving way to what looked like an office. Stacks of ledgers, old files, a rotary phone, a half-empty whiskey bottle, and on the desk a single wooden box, dark oak, carved with the same rose symbol from the wax seal on my letter. My breath caught. This had to be the box my mother mentioned. "The second box you must not open." But if that was the second, where was the first? I hesitated, every rational thought screaming that I should walk away. Instead, I crossed the room and brushed my hand over the lid. It was smooth, polished, and faintly warm, as if it had been touched recently. Then I noticed a faint light leaking through a seam in the floorboards just beneath the desk. I crouched, pressing my ear against the wood. A faint electrical hum buzzed below. I tugged at the corner of the rug and found a small metal ring, a handle. My pulse spiked. I pulled. The panel lifted with a reluctant creak. Below it, a narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. The smell hit me first, cold, damp, almost sterile. Not the musty scent of an old cellar, but the sharp tang of something preserved. I hesitated, staring into the dark void below, and whispered, "Mom, what were you doing?" The silence seemed to answer. I turned on my flashlight and stepped down. Each stair protested softly. The air grew colder. My light caught the outline of metal shelving, tarps, boxes. And then at the far end, a shape, something tall, covered in a white sheet. My fingers trembled as I lifted the fabric. Beneath it was a chair, bolted to the floor, leather straps hanging from the arms. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight beam shook across the room, revealing cameras, a tripod, a monitor, and shelves stacked with dozens of VHS tapes, each neatly labeled with dates that spanned almost 20 years. My mother's name appeared on several, so did my father's, and one other, Clara. I dropped the light. It clattered across the concrete, rolling until it pointed at a small table near the wall. On it sat a framed photograph, the same man again, the one from the photos upstairs, but this time older, thinner, with eyes that seemed to look through me. Beneath the photo, taped to the table, another note: "Now you understand. Don't let him find you before you finish this." I sank to the floor, shaking. My mind spiraled. Him? Who? My father? The man in the pictures? The air felt too thick to breathe. That was when I heard it, the sound of a door opening upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, steady, coming closer. And in that moment, every question I'd buried under grief and logic snapped into clarity. My mother hadn't sent me here to learn. She'd sent me here to run. I didn't move. Not at first. The sound of footsteps above me felt impossibly loud. Slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was knew I was here. Each creak of the old floorboards echoed through the concrete walls, hollow and sharp. My flashlight beam quivered on the floor, still pointing toward that photo of the man. I reached for it, turned it face down. I couldn't look at him anymore. My phone buzzed faintly in my pocket, a single vibration, like a warning. I pulled it out. One new voicemail. No caller ID. For a split second, I almost pressed play. Then another sound froze me. The floor vent above my head creaked slightly, and I realized the footsteps had stopped directly over it. Someone was listening. I switched the phone to silent and waited, holding my breath. The silence stretched. Then a faint click, a door closing upstairs. I didn't wait to find out which one. I grabbed the flashlight and backed toward the small staircase. My legs trembled so badly I could barely keep my balance, but I forced myself upward. Each step sounded too loud. When I reached the top, the hatch was half closed. That wasn't how I'd left it. For one dizzying second I thought about climbing back down, hiding until morning. But then I saw something on the underside of the hatch, a piece of masking tape, with handwriting that made my chest tighten. "He's still watching." I pushed the hatch open and slipped out into the office. The air up here was different now, colder, emptier. I moved carefully toward the hall, listening. Nothing. The house was silent again. I crept toward the stairs, one hand against the wall to steady myself. Every nerve screamed to run, but my mother's words from that first letter echoed in my head. "Follow everything I say. Don't stop halfway." Halfway. That meant there was more. On the hall table near the top of the stairs sat a small leather-bound notebook I hadn't noticed before. It looked too clean to have been sitting there for long. I opened it. Inside were pages of neatly written notes, some in my mother's handwriting, others in a tighter, more masculine script. Names, dates, bank transactions. Then a section labeled Clara, guardianship transfers. My breath caught. There were 2 entries. The first was dated April 2000, the second November 2002. Both bore my mother's signature and another name, Peter Reynolds. That wasn't my father's name. I flipped another page. There was a single black and white photograph paper-clipped to it, a young girl with dark hair standing in a classroom, eyes downcast, wearing my old elementary school's uniform. At the bottom, written in ink, "Temporary ward, Ella M., my name." My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the notebook. I wasn't Clara, but maybe I wasn't just me either. I sank down on the stairs, my head spinning. The realization was like a bruise blooming from the inside out. My mother hadn't just hidden a room. She'd hidden our past. And whoever was in this house, whoever had followed me here, might have been part of it. I needed air. I hurried down the stairs, clutching the flashlight and notebook, and reached the front door. The moment I touched the handle, I froze. Fresh mud, on the mat. There hadn't been any when I came in. I turned, scanning the dim living room. The curtains moved slightly, as if from a draft, but there were no open windows. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass, wide-eyed, pale, shaking. Something flickered behind me. I spun around. The office light upstairs had turned back on. I felt my throat tighten. Slowly I stepped backward toward the door, keeping my eyes on the staircase. Then a voice. Low, calm, almost familiar. "Ella, you shouldn't be here." I went rigid. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled, its beam sweeping across the floor until it caught a pair of shoes at the base of the stairs. Polished leather. I knew those shoes. I'd seen them in old photographs. I whispered, "Peter?" He stepped into the light, older now, maybe late 50s. Gray hair, same sharp eyes from the photo. He looked almost casual, like he'd just stopped by for coffee. But the way he smiled made my stomach twist. "You look just like her," he said softly. "I always knew you'd come back." My voice cracked. "You knew my mother." He tilted his head, studying me. "Better than anyone. She promised she'd keep her word." I clutched the notebook tighter. "Her word. To protect you." My blood went cold. He took a step closer. She thought I was dangerous, but I was the one who saved her. I gave her a way out. You were part of that deal. I don't understand. He smiled faintly. Of course you don't. She never told you the truth about your father. I felt the words hit like a slap. My father's dead, I said, barely audible. He shook his head slowly. No, Ella, he's not. And he's not the man you think he was. For a moment the world seemed to tilt. The air felt too heavy, my pulse roaring in my ears. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet wouldn't move. Peter took another step forward. She left everything here. The evidence, the tapes, the letters. Because she wanted you to finish what she couldn't. What do you mean, finish? His expression darkened. Expose him. He nodded toward the ceiling. Your real father. He built this house. He built everything you grew up believing. But it wasn't clean money. He hurt people, used them. When your mother tried to stop him, she had to disappear. That's why I kept the tapes, so that one day you'd understand. I felt dizzy, my knees weak. Then why hide it from me? Why? Because you weren't ready, he said quietly. And because I didn't trust she'd ever tell you. For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching, heavy with everything I didn't want to believe. Then I heard it, the faint hum from below. The basement lights flickered on by themselves. Peter turned, his face tightening. He's here. Who? Your father. The lights above us snapped off. The house went black. I stumbled backward, heart racing, as Peter grabbed my arm. Go out the back now. I can't see. Go. I turned and ran through the kitchen, fumbling for the back door handle. I burst outside into the cold night air, lungs burning. The rain had started, sharp, relentless, masking every sound behind a wall of white noise. Behind me the house stood in darkness. One light flickered in the upstairs window, my mother's old room. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near the edge of the driveway. I could still see the house in the distance, small and still, like it was pretending nothing had happened. In my hand I still clutched the notebook. Its last page was smeared with water, but one line was still legible, written in my mother's careful handwriting. Now tell the world what he did, before he finds you. I looked back toward the house, toward the man I thought I knew as my father, and the shadow moving behind the window, and in that moment, I finally understood why my mother had called her letter impossible to ignore, because once I knew, I could never go back. The rain didn't stop that night. It came down in heavy, angry sheets, blurring the world around me, turning the road into rivers of light and shadow. My hands trembled so hard that I almost dropped the notebook twice as I ran. My shoes squelched with every step, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house, away from him. When I finally reached the edge of town, the streetlights flickered weakly against the fog. I found an old diner that was still open, its neon sign sputtering. I pushed through the door, shivering so badly the waitress behind the counter looked up in alarm. You okay, honey? She asked. I nodded automatically. Just coffee, please. She poured me a cup, her eyes softening as she slid it toward me. I sat at a corner booth, drenched, staring down at the steaming mug as if it could anchor me to reality. The bell over the door jingled as two truckers came in laughing, and for a brief moment, the normalcy of it all felt surreal, like I'd slipped out of one world and into another. I opened the notebook again. The pages were wrinkled from the rain, some ink bleeding, but the words were still there. Names, transactions, letters. And then at the very back, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small flap of paper, glued beneath the inside cover. I peeled it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a folded note. Ella, if you found this, it means Peter reached you first. He'll tell you parts of the truth, but not all of it. Trust nothing until you see the tapes. They're in the safety deposit box at the bank, box 147-2. You'll need my old wedding ring. It's the key. My mother's handwriting. I stared at it until the letters blurred. I'd buried her 6 months ago, and yet here she was, still guiding me, step by step. The waitress returned with a refill. Rough night? She asked gently. I managed a weak smile. You could say that. When she walked away, I looked down at my hands. My fingers were pale and pruned from the rain, but on my right hand I still wore her wedding ring. I hadn't taken it off since the funeral. Box 147-2. I checked the time, 4:17 a.m. The bank opened at 9. That meant a few hours to stay awake, stay hidden, and stay alive. I texted my friend Megan, the only person who knew I'd gone back to the house. If I don't answer in the morning, call the police. Tell them Peter Reynolds is looking for me. The message sent, but no response came. I stared at the screen until the battery died. When morning finally broke, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The clouds hung low and gray, pressing down on the town. I walked the last few blocks to the bank, soaked through and hollow-eyed. The notebook clutched against my chest like a lifeline. Inside, the security guard gave me a polite nod. You here for a box? Yes, I said, trying to sound normal. 1472. It belonged to my mother, Clara Miller. He led me to a small, windowless room lined with metal drawers. My hands shook as I slipped off the ring and pressed it into the tiny slot on the lock. A soft click. The box slid open. Inside were three things: a stack of cassette tapes, a thin manila envelope, and a small photograph, my mother, much younger, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a legal document, notarized, dated nearly 20 years ago. A confession. The man in the photo was named Daniel Moore, my real father. He'd been charged, quietly, for embezzlement and fraud tied to charity funds, but the case had vanished from record. There was also mention of confidential settlements and external cooperation. My mother had written her own statement at the bottom: "If something happens to me, know that Daniel never stopped. He built his empire on deceit, and others paid the price. If Ella reads this, tell her to find the tapes. The truth is in his own words." My pulse thudded in my throat. I picked up one of the tapes. Written on it, in neat capital letters: April 2, 2003, Daniel Reynolds interview. Reynolds, not Moore. He'd changed his name. He was Peter. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My whole life folded inward. The nights my mother cried when she thought I was asleep, the way she flinched when unknown numbers called, the reason we moved towns every couple of years. She hadn't been paranoid. She'd been running. I looked down at the second tape. It was labeled simply, "Final recording for Ella." My fingers hovered over it. My hands were cold. I found an old cassette player on the shelf beside the desk and slid the tape in. It crackled faintly, then her voice, my mother's, came through, small and trembling. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone, and you've probably already met Peter." A long pause. "I loved him once, before I knew who he really was, before I knew what he'd done. He took everything, the money, the truth, even my name, but he couldn't take you." My throat closed up. "He'll try to convince you I was unstable, that I lied, but the documents prove everything. I hid them where he'd never look, in the foundation of the house he built. That basement wasn't a prison, Ella. It was protection. I built those walls myself to hold the evidence. If you find it, don't destroy it. Share it. Let the world see who he is." The tape hissed softly. Then she whispered, almost inaudible, "He's still watching me, and I think he knows I'm recording this." The tape clicked to silence. I sat frozen. Tears blurred the world. Every piece of the puzzle finally fit, horribly, perfectly. My mother hadn't left me a letter to haunt me. She'd left me instructions to finish her fight. I left the bank in a daze. The sun had broken through the clouds now, but I barely saw it. I went straight to the nearest police station, handed the notebook, the tapes, and the documents to a detective at the front desk. He gave me a skeptical look at first, until he played the first few seconds of the tape. Then his expression shifted. He told me to sit down, asked me everything. Hours passed. Questions, statements, forms, photographs. They promised to open an investigation, but when I left the station, I knew it wasn't over. Peter wouldn't let it be. That night, my apartment felt smaller than ever. I locked every door, every window, checked the peephole twice. Then I sat on the couch, staring at the last remaining thing I hadn't turned in, the final tape. I hadn't played it yet, the one labeled for Ella. My thumb hovered over the play button. Part of me wanted to destroy it, to live in ignorance, to let the past stay buried. But another part, the same stubborn, restless part that had led me back to that house, knew I couldn't stop now. I pressed play. There was silence. Then faintly my mother's voice again. "If you've made it this far, I'm proud of you." I covered my mouth. "I don't know what the world will think of me after this. Maybe they'll call me paranoid. Maybe they'll call me a liar. But I want you to remember something. You're not the product of his sins. You're mine. Every good thing in you came from the light I tried to save." The sound of her breathing filled the room, fragile and human. "If he finds you, don't run this time. Expose him. Tell them everything. And when it's over, go somewhere new, somewhere I never could live." The tape ended with a faint sound. A door creaking open, then silence. I sat there until dawn, her words echoing in my head. The next morning, I called the same journalist who'd once tried to interview my mother years ago, before she vanished from the public eye. He didn't believe me at first, until I sent him copies of the documents. Within a week, the story broke. Headlines, news broadcasts, former financier accused of decades-long fraud, exploitation, and cover-ups. By the end of the month, Peter Reynolds, or Daniel Moore, was arrested. They found everything in the basement, exactly where my mother said it would be. The files, the accounts, the recordings, all of it. It wasn't victory that I felt when the news aired. Not exactly. It was relief. A hollow, trembling kind of relief that comes when the storm finally ends, and all you can do is stand there, drenched, staring at what's left. I drove back to that house one last time. The police tape fluttered in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and closure. In the corner of the basement, I placed my mother's ring on a small shelf, right above where she'd written, "He's still watching." Not anymore. When I stepped outside, the sky was clear, the world impossibly quiet. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was walking toward it, toward peace, toward the life my mother wanted me to have.